Tonight on DBL, our True Crime Chronicles marathon continues. We are reopening the case files and combing through some of the most infamous crimes in America. We continue with the 40-year-old case of Kurt Sova, a young boy whose mysterious death has baffled Cleveland investigators. We sat down exclusively with his only surviving brother. Take a look. Kurt Sova's death is one of the most mysterious cases in the U.S. The Ohio teen's cold case is filled with contradictions and cover-ups. His story, if you remember, made national headlines in the 80s, but was slowly forgotten until now. We have new developments in DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
Just 5 miles south of Cleveland, Ohio, lies Newburgh Heights, a tight-knit community of around 2,000 people.
It has a thumbprint, as all cities leave their thumbprints across the nation.
It's also where Kenneth and Dorothy Sova raised their 4 sons: Kevin, Keith, Kenny, and Kurt.
Kurt was the youngest of 4 brothers, so he tried to follow all of us. His personality was he was very outgoing. He was a comedian. He was just getting going in his life.
Kurt went to a Halloween party on Friday, October 23rd, 1981. The same day he was last seen alive.
Something went awry in the disappearance of my brother. Somebody out there knows what happened.
Friends at the party gave conflicting police reports. Some claim Kurt stepped outside for fresh air and never came back.
Did I know about this party? No.
Debbie Sams told police she never hosted the party, but a pizza delivery man contradicted that statement, claiming he brought several pizzas to her home that night.
There were people at this party that know more than what they said. We believe that there are people out there who have answers to questions.
5 days later, Kurt's dead body was found in a ravine 500 feet from the party, and the same spot his family searched the day before.
We really don't have an official cause of death to say that yes, he was in fact murdered. We don't know 100% if that was the case.
Kurt's death was ruled accidental, but his family believes it was murder. The mysterious circumstances caught national attention and was featured in a 1988 episode of Unsolved Mysteries with host Robert Stack. But over time, the story faded, and Kurt's parents were no longer alive to fight for it.
The case of Kurt Sova went cold decades ago, but his mother went to her grave, never giving up on hope for justice.
4 decades later, the case is reopening. A true miracle for Kevin Sova, the only surviving family member.
At first, I didn't know how to take it. It's been 38 years since my brother died. Was it a hoax? Was it not?
Kurt's story was picked out of thousands to be investigated at CrowdSolve Chicago, a national convention that brings top detectives and experts together to solve a case in less than a week.
Although this unsolved case is nearly 40 years in the past, it is ripe with rumors, comments, tips.
A fresh pair of eyes and new technology could finally bring answers.
Just want to know what happened.
Here in studio is Kevin Sova, the only surviving family member. And Kevin, thank you so much for being here, because I can't even imagine the pain that you have had to endure. I mean, considering that Kurt was your youngest brother, you now have kids of your own. 40 years later, how are you holding up now in 40 years plus compared to when it happened? And do you still have hope?
We do have hope. The fact that the investigative team that is involved in this believes that it's a solvable case, that has to give the family hope. We're very optimistic about that. What I'd like to talk about is, even though this is about Kurt and it's about finding answers of my brother, I'm also involved in this because of my mom. Mm-hmm. The reason I'm here is because of my mom. My mom went to her grave in 2014, never finding out the answers of why her son is gone. She never gave up. When my brother Kenny passed away in 2017, all of Mom's hard work was dropped in my lap, and I never really understood how involved she was. I knew she never gave up looking, but we found boxes of information about anybody my mom talked to for almost 30 some years. And all that information brought forward to the Newburgh Heights Police Department was like finding a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Like Chief Majoy commented, if my mom was here today, he would probably hire her.
Wow.
Right.
The advocacy of a parent, right?
And
pain.
Speaking of being a parent, this happened when you were 22.
Right.
Obviously, you didn't have kids then. You have 3 now.
Right.
How did that affect you as a father going forward?
As I've become more of a mature adult, early on, I wasn't the best father because of the way I lived my life. After Kurt died, our family was tore apart. The 3 remaining brothers had a lot of issues in a lot of different ways. So when I became a dad, I was not the best father figure or the best husband. But I really never understood what my mom and dad went through as far as the pain they went through losing a child. Now, 40 years later, especially after this case is opened back up, and I started to read all the notes and all the different things that my mom jotted down in her pain, that I could not understand what it would be like to lose one of my kids.
Right.
Kurt, I just want to say, what's your mother's name? Remind me?
Dorothy.
Dorothy. This is for Dorothy. I want to ask this for you and Dorothy. They are ruling the death accidental. Do you think that's true? And also, are you confident about CrowdSolve, that crime con that Sam was talking about to solve it? But do you really think Dorothy thinks it was accidental?
I don't believe it was accidental, but I'm also not 100% sure that somebody purposely murdered him. My honest opinion is Kurt made some bad decisions that night, put himself in a very vulnerable situation, and I feel the people that he was with, or the people that he was with for whatever time he was alive, didn't step forward and do the right thing.
Oh, gosh.
I feel that if some things were handled different back then with my brother, maybe they could have got him to a hospital earlier, maybe they could have called the family, maybe we wouldn't be sitting here now. But Kurt was alive from the time he disappeared from the party for a number of days. It still hasn't been, back then it was a guess. They're looking a little bit more into it now, and I think they're gonna come up with a little bit more of a clean line. But I'm very optimistic that we're gonna have some kind of resolution, whether it's what the family wants to hear or not.
It's closure.
It's yet to be determined.
Thank you for having the courage to speak about this, to get the knowledge out to the public, because the more people that know of this, hopefully the more we can find answers. If you want to learn more about Kurt's story or help solve this case alongside police, go to crimecon.com/crowdsolvechicago. You can help. Beloved wife and mother Jennifer Dulos disappeared 9 months ago in Connecticut. Her estranged husband was recently charged with murder, but a new twist has left investigators baffled. We have an update on this case that grabbed national headlines in today's True Crime Chronicles.
Jennifer and Fotis Dulos were college sweethearts at Brown University. In 2004, they relocated to Farmington, Connecticut to start a family. They had 5 children, 2 sets of twins, and a daughter. In 2017, Jennifer files for divorce. Over the next 2 years, the couple became estranged amid a nasty custody dispute.
It's an exhausting fight. I love my children. That's about it.
In late May, Jennifer drops the kids off at school and is never seen again. She's reported missing that day. Police find her blood inside the garage of her home. That same evening, Fotis and his girlfriend, Michelle Troconis, are caught on camera dumping garbage bags containing Jennifer's blood.
You know, I know what I've done and I know what I haven't done. So I have to stand and fight and hope that the truth is going to come out.
10 days later, Fotis and his girlfriend are charged with tampering evidence. They plead not guilty. Then, months later, Fotis is charged with kidnapping and murdering Jennifer. His girlfriend and former lawyer Kent Mawhinney are also charged in connection to the case. But his new attorney insists there's no evidence of a murder.
There's no body. What we have is a suspicious disappearance and an entirely circumstantial case. What these charges tell us is the state has evidence and doesn't know what to make of it.
Weeks later,
Yukon Fire for a medic and an ambulance expedited response.
Fotis fails to show up for an emergency bail hearing. Officers try checking on him at home.
They could see through a window that Mr. Dulos was sitting in his vehicle, and he had obvious signs of medical distress.
Fotis was rushed to a hospital for carbon monoxide poisoning.
Fotis Dulos was declared dead tonight at 5:32.
His death was ruled a suicide. He left behind a suicide note proclaiming his innocence. Almost a year later, and dozens of searches, Jennifer's body still hasn't been found. What happened to the loving mother of 5?
Earlier, Tori Allen and I spoke with a reporter who's been following this case since the start. We are joined now by anchor and reporter Ben Goldman from Fox 61 in Hartford, Connecticut. Thank you, Ben, for joining us. Now, this is a very timely case. There are new developments right now. So Fotis Dulos recently died by suicide. Since he was charged with murdering his ex-wife, what happens now? Will his murder trial continue?
This is just the latest of the twists and turns that have gone on since May 24th of last year. His attorney, Norm Pattis, came out the night that Fotis died and said that he wants to continue not only the civil case, but the criminal case. And a lot of legal experts that we spoke to are kind of dumbfounded by this, because how do you continue a criminal case if your suspect is no longer here? But he says he wants the estate of Fotis Dulos to go on. He says he wants to clear his client's name, and we're going to wait and see if that's been done. It's never been done before in the state of Connecticut. His attorney wants to continue it. We'll see if that actually comes to fruition or not.
Wow, a posthumous trial. I've never heard. This story has me reading up into all hours of the night. Jennifer's body has never been found, but Fotis left behind a suicide note. So I want to know, did it say anything or leave any clues behind as to where Jennifer might be?
It was a lengthy note, and essentially it was proclaiming his innocence, saying that he had nothing to do with it, saying that his girlfriend who was arrested had nothing to do with it, his friend and former attorney who was also arrested had nothing to do with it, telling his children that he loves them, but everyone, in his words, has their limits. And then he ended the note apologizing to this new character involved in this saga, Anna Curry, this woman from North Carolina who apparently paid Fotis Dulos' latest bond, who was seen at his house the day that he committed suicide. No clues, a lot of unanswered questions, and Fotis Dulos died proclaiming his innocence.
I'm just wondering, like, obviously we're talking about this on a national level, but what is the temperature going on in Connecticut right now? Like, what are people saying, and what have you picked up as a reporter?
It's very frustrating because your main character in this almost years-long story is no longer around.
Right.
And there's been no concrete ending to it. So a lot of people are still curious about it. A lot of people are still talking about it. It'll be interesting to see how it proceeds going forward now that Fotis Dulos is no longer around. The bottom line here is that so many of us really feel bad for his 5 kids who now don't have a mother, don't have a father, who are living with their grandmother in Manhattan, who's in their 70s or 80s. Just their mental and emotional struggle that they're going to have to deal with. That's really the thing that breaks a lot of people's hearts.
I pray for the truth, for the children, for everyone that's been involved and invested in this case. For the latest updates on the Dulos' case and to read the full story, visit fox61.com. A pregnant mother and her boyfriend were mistakenly murdered by members of a dangerous drug cartel. One of the men charged could be back on the streets this year, but how is that possible? Well, we have an update in today's True Crime Chronicles.
Lanoska Torres and Luis Campos were two young teens in love. They were living in Dallas, Texas, getting ready to become new parents.
My sister was a good girl. She was about to be a mom.
It was January 6th, 2007. The couple drove to Oak Cliff to pick up Luis's car at a mechanic's home. They never made it back home that night.
She did not deserve this.
When Lanoska and Luis showed up for their car, they were kidnapped, tortured, and beaten for days.
Did she plead for her baby's life?
It was a case of mistaken identity. 3 members of a dangerous Mexican drug cartel mistook Lanoska and Luis as a couple who had stolen cash and drugs from the cartel's lead hitman, Nicolas Menores. Nearly a month later, police found Luis, Lanoska, and her 5-month-old baby's bodies dumped off a bridge.
My first granddaughter, I never meet. I just meet her for the sonogram picture.
Dallas detectives botched the investigation and evidence in this case, allowing 2 of the men to take plea deals. Frank Estrella, who dumped the bodies, was let out on parole in 2017 after only serving 5 years behind bars.
It's just kind of crazy that he can keep on with his life.
And now, the main hitman, Nicolas Menores, who was sentenced to 15 years, could be released as early as this year.
Doesn't make sense in my head that they can say, oh yeah, let's make a deal with you, but you didn't do a deal with us.
Jorge Guzman Banda is the only one serving a life sentence. As for the others, the Torres family struggles to think these men will be back on the streets soon because of a botched investigation.
It is not fair. It's not fair.
And earlier, Tori, Al, and Lindsay spoke with a reporter who's been covering the case for over a decade. Take a look.
We're joined by senior crime and justice reporter Rebecca Lopez from WFAA in Dallas, Texas. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. Detectives admit they botched parts of the investigation. I want to know exactly when went wrong, and did they ever take responsibility, because this makes my skin crawl.
Yeah, the detectives never took responsibility. The DA's office, though, obviously knew there was something wrong when they went to go look at the interrogation tapes. And my sources say, they never really said, but my sources say that there was coercion and there was also issues with how the Miranda rights were read, or not read, actually. And so what is really galling is that the main guy, the guy that was one of the most violent cartel members, he only gets 15 years. They had to plea bargain. The family didn't even realize that there was a plea bargain until they got to court, and then they realized then that he was going to get a 15-year sentence and they weren't going to get to go to trial. And he's the main guy that led the kidnapping, the torture of this pregnant girl and her boyfriend.
Oh my gosh.
He was the main cartel violent guy.
Wow.
You know, after you saying, I can't believe I even have to ask this question, but Nicholas is eligible for parole soon.
Ugh.
How likely is it that he'll be released this year, and how are we even talking about this? How is this even a possibility?
He'll get out because of that plea bargain. It was 15 years. Now, here's the only thing that the family has some comfort in. He is a Mexican national, so he will most likely be extradited back to Mexico. But he is known to come back and forth across the border. He was one of the main hit guys for the Mexican drug cartel called the Gulf Cartel. And so he is going to, at one point, he will get out. There is no doubt about it. He only got a 15-year sentence, and he is done with it, and he will be released.
Ugh, God.
And Rebecca, it's now been more than 10 years. So how are the victims' families still fighting for justice?
You know, here's the sad part. They will never get the justice that they deserve because of how this case was handled from the very beginning, when DPD didn't take this case seriously, the Dallas Police Department, to the very end when these confessions were messed up. and this case was messed up. So they'll never really get any kind of justice. The only justice they get is when we do stories like this and we let their legacies live on of Luis and Lanoska, this beautiful young couple that was getting ready to have a baby. It is important to note, though, that the two detectives that botched this case, they're no longer with the Dallas Police Department. They retired. DPD had to go back and look at all of their cases to make sure that there weren't any other issues, and so they're still in the process, actually, of looking through all of those cases that they had in the past as well. But this family, they'll never really get the justice they deserved.
Wow. Well, thank you for keeping the ball rolling on this, because at least someone is keeping that legacy, and we depend on people like you. Thank you, Rebecca. To read more on this case, please visit WFAA.com. You can also learn more in a new podcast episode out now. Just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Again, Rebecca, thank you so much. We'll be right back.
For the past 4 years, a mystery has loomed in the woods of Atlanta. A man allegedly attacked his mother and girlfriend and was never, ever seen again. So where did he go? And could he still be alive? Here's a look in today's True Crime Chronicles.
Darius Jones was just 20 years old. He was working odd-end jobs in Georgia with aspirations of becoming a chef. It was October 15th, 2016, a day his girlfriend will never forget.
I don't know what's wrong with him. He's hitting me, he's grabbing me.
Darius attacks and chokes his girlfriend. She narrowly escapes and hides underneath the apartment staircase, calling police and Darius's mother for help.
So when he seen her, it's like he just went into a rage, because I said, he was telling me she the devil, mama don't talk to her, she the devil, she the devil.
Shakora Jones tries to calm her son down, but fears for her own life and desperately calls police again.
Just stay on the phone with me, okay?
But I'm really afraid for my life.
She tells police not to shoot her son.
Just stun him. If you have people, don't kill him, please.
One of you is telling police, don't shoot him.
He is a big guy. He potentially was under the influence of something, and no, I did not want them to kill my son.
They never shot him because police couldn't find him.
We searched that entire section of woods, and it backs up to 316.
He vanished, leaving everything behind.
So this is his wallet?
All his stuff, his ID, his bank card, all his personal information.
Stuff you can't really get far if you don't have.
A private investigator took over the case, but ran into dead ends.
There's no proof that he's dead, and there's no proof that he's alive.
The one clue? Sakura says her son recently admitted to taking acid a week before he disappeared.
I think it's curiosity, you know, when he told me he had tried it. And I'm like, don't try it no more.
Are you afraid he did try one more?
I think he did.
And you can have psychosis, what we call drug-induced psychosis. And some people don't come back from it.
What do you mean?
It's altered the function and the structure of their brain.
Meaning he could still be out there, alive and hiding, or hurting others.
Earlier, Tori Allen Brandon spoke with a reporter who covered this case from the beginning. Take a look.
We are joined now by investigative reporter Rebecca Lindstrom from 11 Alive in Atlanta, Georgia. Rebecca, it's been 4 years now. Do you think Darius is still out there, and any idea of where possibly he could have gone?
That is a tough one, because you want to be hopeful, right? And there is reason for optimism. We haven't found his body or his bones, despite disappearing in a major metro area. But on the flip, if he is alive, no matter how upset or ashamed, you would think in 4 years he would have reached out to someone in his family, some friend. So what I really do wish, wherever he is that either way, this family could get some closure.
Rebecca, I have to ask you, how are the victims, you know, his mother, his former girlfriend, how are they doing? And just basically, what do they want to see happen with this case?
They have so much compassion for him. We had an opportunity to talk with his girlfriend, and even after she experienced all of this, all she really wants is for him to be found, to know what's really happened to him. I think that there's just this confusion, this sadness, this frustration in not knowing. It is so mysterious to think of someone without shoes, without a shirt, just disappearing. Now, who would give that person a ride in a car, right? And if they did, you think they'd remember it, and then they would call police when they realized that this was a story, was a case. with that kind of tip and information for police to be able to follow.
Rebecca, as an investigative reporter, you're used to covering these type of stories, so what makes this one stand out from the rest?
I think it is just the nature of his disappearance. I think one of the tragedies that happened after his disappearance was the cell phone. His mother had kept that phone active, hoping that if a friend were to call Darius, on his number, that she might be able to get some leads or information from that friend, or perhaps if that's the only number that he remembered, that he would call it and then she'd be able to reach out to him. Well, police asked for that phone. They wanted to be able to search it for clues, but in the process of doing that forensic investigation, that cell phone was lost. It is yet to be recovered, so it is just one more mystery, one more disconnect for this family as they search for someone they love so dearly.
Another loss for the family. I mean, they have to get a win. Well, I hope keeping this in the news will do that. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Read more on this case, visit 11alive.com. You can also learn more in a new podcast episode out now. Just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Rebecca, thanks again. 40 years ago, a young woman was just starting her radio career when the unimaginable happened. She was abducted and murdered. Finally, a crack in the case, thanks to a stranger and a beer mug. We have an update in DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
Helene Brzezinski was a 21-year-old college student from Massachusetts. The aspiring journalist moved to Denver for an internship at KHOW Radio.
Although I had only worked with her a very short time, I was convinced right away that she was very bright and had a great sense of humor.
It was January 16th, 1980. Helene was just 2 weeks on the job when she went missing.
It's believed that Ms. Brzezinski got off her bus after work here Wednesday night. She was abducted sometime after that.
The next day,
Ms. Brzezinski's body was found early Thursday. She'd been sexually assaulted and stabbed.
Her co-worker, Bob Scott, would be the one to help identify her body.
This was the toughest assignment I ever had. As a reporter, I'd seen a lot of people dead, but this was a friend of mine.
Police launched a full investigation in search of the killer.
We make as many contacts as we can immediately after a thing like this in an effort to try to talk with people when their memories are still in focus and that they can remember substantial information.
Investigators collected DNA at the scene, but it wasn't enough. A year later, the case went cold. And then, nearly 40 years later,
here we are today where we have an individual who is in custody.
James Curtis Clanton. Investigators had his DNA for years, but there was never a match in the FBI's database. The breakthrough came from genetic genealogy.
Once we started working the genealogy, coming down his family tree, it appeared that his mother was a dead end, but she wasn't.
They found a woman in Georgia who took a genealogy test last summer. Parts of her DNA matched the killer's.
I did not know him. I was a small link in them narrowing it down. I don't even know. It's surreal.
Thanks to Jesse's DNA, investigators were able to make more connections and track down Clanton in Florida. They took his beer mug at a local bar and tested his DNA. It was a match from the crime scene nearly 40 years ago. Clanton was extradited back to Colorado.
How then do you plead to murder in the first degree after deliberation?
Guilty. Clanton puts up no fight.
It was very unusual to hear that kind of remorse and gratitude for the opportunities that he knew he didn't deserve, but that he got.
Most of Brzezinski's relatives have since passed, except for her sister, who can finally find closure 40 years later.
Earlier, Al Lindsay and I spoke with a reporter who's been following the case. Let's take a look. We're joined by investigative reporter Kevin Vaughn from 9 News in Denver. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. There's been a huge break in the case. James Clanton pled guilty, right? But did he ever say why he went after Helene? Ever?
He has not said that yet. He's scheduled for sentencing April 10th, and that's the time when he will have a chance to make a statement in court. Whether he'll talk about why he did this, I guess, is another question.
Do you think he will, knowing this case?
Well, he did two things that are unusual. He immediately waived extradition after he was arrested in Florida, and they brought him right back here. And then he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Did not put the family, the Brzezinski family, through the pain of a trial and that sort of thing. So, you know, I don't know.
Interesting.
I have to ask you this, Kevin. This took place in the 1980s. The law was different then. Does that mean that we might see him get released early, or like how does this affect his sentence?
Yeah, so the 1980 first-degree murder law in Colorado, he will be eligible for parole after 20 years.
Wow.
That doesn't mean he'll be paroled. He'd still have to go to the parole board and have it approved. But he's in his early 60s, so he's going to serve at least into his 80s. And you know, it's hard to predict what a parole board might do 20 years down the road. But he will be eligible for parole. Unlike today, somebody convicted of first-degree murder today gets life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Now, there are reports that James could possibly be linked to other cases in Colorado back in the 90s. Have police followed up on that lead?
That is being investigated. One of the issues is that the statute of limitations on sexual assault is short. It's just a few years, unlike murder, which there is no statute of limitations. So they are looking at some older unsolved sexual assaults to see if there are links. To date, they have not made any of those.
Wow. That's always why I've pushed for longer statute of limitations for sexual assault victims. Some of them can't come forward, some don't remember, or things like this happen.
Right.
Kevin, thank you so much for being here. To read more on this case, please visit 9news.com. You can also learn more in a new podcast episode out now. Just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Kevin, thanks again. We'll be right back.
Thanks, Kevin.
For the past 3 decades, an alleged killer was on the loose for a brutal robbery and a brutal murder. All these years later, the massive manhunt has come to an end. We have an update in a True Crime Chronicles and a warning to some of our viewers. You may find some of the footage disturbing. Let's take a look.
It was a snowy Sunday night in Montgomery County, Maryland. 57-year-old James Essel had just purchased this old country store. A customer walks in and pays for a bottle of wine. What happens next? James's family will never forget.
I would do something like that.
Police say a customer struck his wine bottle over James's head, stole money from the register, and proceeded to stab him 29 times. The man got away, and police never found him.
I felt like no one cared, and they just forgot about him.
A few years ago, cold case detectives gave the case a second look. They ran a sample of blood found on the cash register using modern DNA and genealogy testing. They developed this composite of the suspect and were able to track down a relative. Soon, they found a DNA match to the crime scene.
How can someone live like that all these years knowing, what he did?
The suspect was identified as Hans Alejandro Huitz. He was living in Virginia Beach. Officers confront him in his car, and Huitz pulls out a gun. U.S. Marshals and cold case detectives plead over and over for Huitz to surrender.
Drop the gun!
And then police open fire. Officers kill him. Some closure for James's family, but it still remains a mystery as to why Huitz targeted him at that store nearly 30 years ago.
And of course, we want answers. We want to know why, and we may not ever know why.
Wow. Earlier, Al, Lindsay, and I spoke with an investigative reporter who has been following this case. Take a look. We're joined by reporter Bruce Leshan from WUSA in Washington, D.C. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us. A violent ending to a nearly 30-year manhunt. Police finally found a suspect and shot and killed him. So tell me, where does the case stand now, and what is the protocol for that officer involved?
Well, it's the key thing that happens always in police shootings. People are put on administrative leave if they were involved in a shooting.
Right.
And then there's a big investigation, and they try and determine if the shooting was justified. And at some point, there are all these processes and then at some point the officer will go back on the street. So you kind of heard how many times they tried to get him to put the gun down on the tape. That's what's remarkable in this case.
Right.
At one point they say he waved the gun at them and they felt like they needed to take action. So that's what's being looked into right now.
Interesting.
All right, Bruce, can you just tell us how the cops were able to get this guy? And did he know that they were outside surrounding his home?
No, and he ended up in his car, and how they got him is just amazing. I mean, they have this amazing cold case squad in Montgomery County, and Montgomery County has been going back. This is just outside of Washington, D.C., a suburb of Washington, D.C., and they've been going back and looking at a bunch of old cold cases. They found the guy who abducted two girls from a shopping mall 30 years ago as well, and they tracked him down. And now they've tracked this guy down. So they're doing all kinds of work. And what it really is about is kind of a combination of old-style genealogy, you know, looking at people's family trees, and kind of the latest cutting-edge DNA technology. So they were able to come up with a DNA profile from the blood spatters at the scene at that store. And that led them to a guy that they went and they took a swab from him. It turned out it wasn't the right guy. They took that sample back, looked at it, determined that it was a very close relative, either a father or a brother of the killer from the scene. The father was dead, and the guy only had one brother, so that's how they got their man.
Now, Bruce, this
Isn't
all
that
unfolded.
Amazing.
This all unfolded over the past months. How is James' daughter coping with the news, and what did she tell you?
You know, I have talked to her repeatedly, and she has, her whole life has been affected, and her sister passed away before the cops figured out who had killed their father. She was terribly sad about that.
Wow.
Perpetua is glad that there's some closure here, that there's some answers, but she's mad that she'll never know why. I mean, here her dad was killed for what seems like no reason, and because the accused killer died in this shootout, she will never know for certain why he would have done it. There was no reason to do it. I mean, it's so often here in these kinds of cases, James Essel was a guy that would give you the shirt off his back. He was a guy who came from Ghana, worked his way up. He'd been a banker, he'd been a restaurant owner, decided to settle in this small town and open this store out in rural Montgomery County because it reminded him of the hills of Ghana where he came from. And then somebody comes into his store, stabs him 29 times, part of it with the wine bottle that he had actually just purchased in the store.
God, such a tragic ending. I'm glad she got closure, but I know there's more questions left open, like the motive, for instance. We want to thank you, Bruce, so much. To read more on this case, visit WUSA.com.
Robert Barron was a family man, happily married to his wife and extremely close with his 3 children. He grew up in Old Forge, Pennsylvania, and took over the family business, Gigarelli's, in 1961. The popular pizza place was locally known as the pizza capital of the world, but the restaurant that was once booming with business was forced to close its doors.
I feel like his presence is there, but once I'm there, it's like, where is he?
Maria Barron and her family closed shop after Robert mysteriously disappeared.
It's torture. I feel like someone is killing me, but just not finishing the job.
The Barrons haven't seen Robert in 3 years. He went missing in January 2017.
He left around 10:25 that night, January 25th, and that was the last time I saw him. My son called me at 9:05 on January 26th and said, "Mom, do you know where Dad is?"
Robert worked a strict routine. He often spent the night at the pizza shop at an apartment above, so he could meet the dough delivery man in the early morning hours. But when his son, Robert Jr., showed up that morning to meet him, the dough was waiting out front, and there was no sign of his dad.
I mean, I would mention to him numerous times, we need to get security cameras in here, but he would just kind of brush it off as, nobody's, and of course you never think something like this is ever going to happen either.
Police searched the restaurant and discovered blood and a tooth. Months later, they would learn it matched Robert's DNA.
Would somebody keep him hostage this long? Because he would never not pick up a phone if he had a phone to call us. He would never do that to his family.
Robert's family and friends held search parties for weeks.
I know Bobby a long time, and I feel that you need to find closure. He still could be out there and maybe need some help.
Those who knew the successful family and businessman fear someone who knew him well did something to hurt him.
This is a small town, and somewhere along the line, I think somebody should have spotted something that could give more clues.
We're joined by reporter Stacey Lang from WNEP in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us. It's been 3 years since Robert vanished. Are there any new updates, and what are police doing just to keep this investigation open and alive?
Yeah, well, to answer your question directly, no, there really aren't any new updates. It is still a very open case that's being handled by our local district attorney's office here in the Scranton area, but there haven't really been any updates as far as the police investigation goes. We go into this in the podcast, but the family of Robert Barron really believes that the secret to finding him lies in their own community. They think someone they possibly even know might have the secret to finding him, so they're just playing this waiting game right now, hoping that that person, whoever it may be, eventually comes forward.
Wow.
Now, Stacey, from what I've been able to ascertain, the restaurant is still closed. What took over the spot, and do you think the family will ever reopen the business?
Yeah, it is still closed, and no one has taken it over. It's still empty. There's actually a sign out front to this day. It's been up there for 3 years with a picture of Robert Barron, advertising reward for information and finding him, and it's still closed. The family hopes to reopen it someday, but it's just not something that they're emotionally ready to do right now.
That's really hard. Now, I just have to know, you know the temperature of the community and the people in Scranton. Do they think Robert's still alive?
No, not really. I mean, the family talks about this in the podcast as well, but there was so much blood evidence at the scene that if he were alive when he left the restaurant, he would be in pretty rough shape. Yeah. And everybody who knows Robert Barron, he was very well known in the community, knows that if he were alive at this point, he probably would have found a way to contact his family by now, and there's been nothing.
Wow. Thank you so much, Stacey. And we are thinking of that family. To read more on this case, visit WNEP.com. Thanks again. We hope this spurs some action in the community.
It was a cold December night. Two friends, 15-year-old Sarah Harbinson and 13-year-old Amy Ayers, were hanging out at a mall in Austin, Texas. They were waiting for Sarah's sister Jennifer and co-worker Eliza Thomas to finish their shifts at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop. Around 10 that night, all the girls met up at the shop and planned to go home for a slumber party. But none of them made it home.
You don't ever think anybody's gonna come into a yogurt place and shoot you. I mean, and shoot you and all your friends. It just doesn't happen in a yogurt place.
Just before midnight, Austin police see smoke rising from the mall and discover the unimaginable.
We heard a knock on the door at 5:15 in the morning, and it's the cops telling us there was a fire at the yogurt shop. They wanted to know if we were the parents of Amy Ayers.
Amy, Jennifer, Sarah, and Eliza were all found dead. The teens were shot in the back of their heads, and their bodies were left to burn, along with most of the evidence. 8 painful years passed until police arrested 4 men and charged them with capital murder.
We finally got answers. Somebody's gonna pay for the crime.
But that sense of justice quickly vanished. 2 of the suspects' charges were dropped. The other 2, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, were convicted, only for the court to later overturn their cases.
It's wonderful, and I'd like to thank God and my families and my attorney.
Prosecutors argued there wasn't any forensic evidence in the case to convict the 4 men.
There comes a point when, what else do you do? I mean, we've exhausted all the means that are available to us at this point.
In 2017, Austin PD found a male-only DNA database in Florida. They uploaded a DNA sample from Amy's body and got a match to a sample in the Florida database. That match happened to be uploaded by the FBI.
It was from the FBI. We thought, well, now that is really exciting news because that's a law enforcement agency. And we surely will get full cooperation in seeing what we can learn from this piece of DNA.
But they were wrong. The FBI wouldn't release any information about their sample because it was given to the Florida database for research, and all donors have to remain anonymous.
I thought this was going to be the break that was really going to help us. And what do? We get slapped in the face by the FBI.
The match in this database can't identify a single suspect, but it does reveal a person's male lineage, meaning you could trace its father and ancestors.
To them, it may not be information they think would be helpful to us. They don't know all the details of our case either, and there might be some little something that is a glimmer of hope that our police department can connect.
So for now, the only glimpse of hope lies in a public research database being protected by the FBI.
There are 4 dead girls, 4 families that have gone through 29 years of hell. And you're causing more pain for these families sitting back knowing that you've got the information and you won't get it. How can you do that?
It's a wild twist in a heartbreaking mystery that began nearly 3 decades ago.
I will not die until this is solved. This is my little girl. And I want justice.
We are joined by senior reporter Tony Plahetsky from KVUE in Austin, Texas. Thank you so much, Tony, for joining us. What are Austin investigators doing to keep this case alive? Have they considered even subpoenaing the FBI to get the DNA information?
Well, Tori, as you know, this investigation has spanned nearly 30 years, but in the past couple of years, investigators really have intensified their efforts to solve this crime once and for all. They have appointed a new team of investigators to not only go over the scientific evidence, but also reams of evidence from past investigations. Yes, they have considered subpoenaing the FBI, but we're told that that really would be a laborious process, and I think they are unsure just how effective that might be.
Interesting.
Now, Tony, I don't have to tell you, this case has received national attention. The U.S. representatives even sent a letter to the FBI. Has anything come of that?
Well, that letter was sent just before the COVID-19 pandemic began. But I am told that behind the scenes, at least, that letter has had some impact, that perhaps the conversations between the FBI and the local investigators have picked up momentum, and that there is an increased willingness for both of them to try to get on the same page, to do all that they can to try to solve this case.
Wow. And Tony, like you said, it's been 30 years. And you definitely say that this has affected and shaped Austin. Have there been any laws that have been passed or anything? Or do you think it's just a general public sentiment that people know that big city crimes happen here in Austin now?
Yeah, from what I've been told, I wasn't here in 1991, but people who have lived here for many years just talk about the shift of mindset that happened after the yogurt shop case. It was obviously so gruesome and so grisly. 4 teenage girls who really were just at a yogurt shop, which we all know were very popular in the early 1990s. But in terms of any sort of new laws or legislation, I think that could be something interesting that comes out of what's happening now with regard to the forensic evidence. We're just going to have to wait and see.
Our hearts are with Austin and with the families. Thank you, Tony. To read more on the case, visit kvue.com. You can also listen to the podcast episode, Austin Yogurt Shop Murders, out now. You just have to search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Again, Tony, thank you for great reporting.
In the 1980s, a mystery crept along major highways and isolated truck stops.
2 weeks ago, authorities discovered the badly decomposed body of a red-haired woman in Cheatham County near Nashville.
Weeks passed, and more women were found dead.
Now authorities in Greene County discovered the body of yet another redheaded victim.
Public attention just really drew to this idea of one man killing all of these redheads.
The media dubbed it the Redhead Murders.
Let's face it, people are interested in mysteries and people that commit those crimes. You never know what evil lurks in people.
He saw that evil firsthand when responding to a call New Year's morning, 1985.
I went up to the crime scene. The body was found over a guardrail down an embankment. We recovered the blanket and what we felt was the body inside of it.
It wasn't until 2018, using new DNA fingerprint technology, that the victim was identified as Tina Marie Farmer. A year later, another break in the case.
So in December, we announced that we had discovered that DNA located on her body and material that she was wrapped in contained the DNA of Jerry Johns.
What should have been a major break was a bust. Jerry Johns, a former truck driver, was dead. He died in prison, serving time for assaulting, kidnapping, and attempting to kill a young, red-haired woman in Knoxville back in 1985. He strangled that woman and left her on the side of a road to die.
She asked Johns, "Are you going to kill me?" And he said, "Yes."
She made it out alive. Johns was arrested and sentenced to prison in 1987 and died there in 2015. He could have been convicted in Tina's case if he were still alive today.
To discover after all those years that we had identified, who this killer was, but it was deflating to know that he had died, just shortly before our discovery of this DNA.
It begs the question, could Jerry Johns be responsible for all of the Redhead murders?
To be able to say that he is the guy, we're not there. Just because the color of someone's hair is the same, and even just because the cases are the same, it doesn't always add up to enough.
There are 6 known cases spanning several states. Could they be linked?
We're joined by reporter Leslie Ackerson and senior investigative journalist John North from WBIR in Knoxville, Tennessee. Leslie, John, thank you both for joining us. Leslie, this question's for you. Detectives recently discovered Jerry Johns' DNA on Tina Farmer, but now that he's dead, what happens with Tina's case and how will her family get any justice?
Unfortunately, that is one of the disappointing parts about this case. It's exciting to know that after all these years of not knowing in the work that detectives, TBI has put in, that they were able to make that link, but he will never go to courts. He will never go to jail for these crimes because he is dead. I think Tina's family is going to have to walk away with the closure and comfort of knowing that they got that answer, but you don't get to have that final say in courts,
That is sad. That is hard.
Well, investigators have described Mr. Johns as a very intelligent man. Do you find that to be true? And does he fit like the stereotypical serial killer mold?
Al, he was a smart guy. He was also pretty cunning, and he was also pretty egotistical. He sort of reminded me of Ted Bundy in that he thought he was a little bit smarter than the cops, and he would tell them that. He liked to brag to the cops that he knew all about serial killers, that he'd read about them. And he liked to taunt the cops. They were sort of glad ultimately that justice was served in finding out that he was the man who killed Tina Farmer. He also did a lot of work. He thought he was so smart that he could do his own legal papers, and he would handwrite motion after motion after motion on his own behalf. At one point, one of the victims who survived actually sued him while he was sitting in jail to try to get damages back. This will show you the kind of man he was. He turned around and sued her.
Oh my goodness.
What narcissism. John, I have a question. In your years reporting on these cases, do you feel there is a possibility that Jerry Johns could be linked to other cases? And are police still looking for that theory?
I think there's a great chance that he did do more. We have other unsolved cases in the Southeast, not just Tennessee. But in addition, the TBI is telling us we're still looking into it. So I'm confident that they're looking into it. The question will be, Tori, does the evidence still exist from 30-some years ago to link him to those crimes.
Thank you so much, Leslie and John. Excellent work. To read more on this case, visit WBIR.com. Now, you can also listen to the podcast episode, The Redhead Murders. It's out now. Just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Thanks again, guys. A former Texas high school principal was convicted of killing his wife in 1985. Well, now, 3 decades later, there's a huge turn in the case. Here is the shocking update in True Crime Chronicles.
Joe Bryan was the principal of Clifton High School in Texas. He was married to Mickey, an elementary school teacher in the same school district.
He was a gentle soul, liked everybody, got along with everybody, very musical. I never heard him say a bad word about anybody.
One morning in 1985, Mickey failed to show up for work. Joe was at a conference in Austin, 120 miles away, when police found Mickey's body inside the Bryans' home. Days later, police find a flashlight with bloodstains on it in Joe's car. He's then convicted of killing his wife.
It's not in his makeup to do what they said he did. He just couldn't have done it.
Joe was sentenced to 99 years in a Texas prison.
When I first came in, I was angry with God. I was mad at the world. I didn't understand what had happened and why it had happened. I just knew that I was innocent.
A huge break came in 2018 when a retired police detective admitted he may have made some mistakes in his original findings when he tested the bloodstains on the flashlight.
There was never a second thought in anybody's mind, at least in my mind, that he had anything at all to do with this.
After 7 attempts to file for parole over a span of 30 years, a judge finally granted it this March.
I had to be in prison for something I didn't do, and you go through all of the shame, humiliation, and embarrassment of all that happening to you. Plus, my family was experiencing all this with me too.
Joe, now 79 years old, is still fighting the case while out on parole. His defense team is petitioning the Supreme Court for relief. Joe still says he's innocent, but in the eyes of the law, he's guilty.
Eric and I interviewed a reporter who actually spoke with Joe Bryan and has been investigating this case. Take a look at this. We're joined by anchor Leslie Draffin from KCEN in Temple, Texas. Thank you for joining us, Leslie. Now, Joe is out on parole. You spoke to him on the phone recently. How is he handling everything right now?
I talked to Joe the day after he got out on parole, actually, and he was happy and excited, just like you would imagine he would be. He also seemed peaceful and calm in a way, and he wasn't bitter at all about all that he has been through.
Wow.
With that said, though, I think he's still really passionate about clearing his name and ultimately finding out who really killed Mickey, because he still maintains his innocence.
Now, the retired detective actually admitted he made some mistakes investigating the bloodstains found on the flashlight. Can you explain more of what happened?
Her case was one of the first cases he ever did. He was tasked with looking at the crime scene, and when they found the flashlight, he was the one who ultimately discovered and said the killer was holding the flashlight in his hand when he shot Mickey at close range. So skip to 2018. After Robert Thorman saw the evidentiary hearing and the testimony by these newer witnesses, he came back and said, well, I might have made some mistakes. And in a 2015 affidavit, he actually also said that if the flashlight does not have blood on it, because DNA testing on the flashlight's been inconclusive as to whether that really was blood, he said in 2015, if it's not blood on the flashlight, then everything I said was wrong.
Wow. Leslie, there was another murder in Clifton around that same time that Mickey died. Do you think at all that they could be related?
Just a brief summary of what that was. In the summer of 1985, a 17-year-old girl, Judy Whitley, was murdered. And 10 years later, after her case went cold, a former Clifton police officer committed suicide after Dennis Dunlap committed suicide, they ultimately said he killed Judy. But what also happened in that suicide was Dennis Dunlap's ex-wife came forward and said that he had told her years back he'd been with the principal's wife the night she died, which would have been Mickey. And then they also found a pair of boots where Dennis Dunlap committed suicide in his hotel room that may have been linked to Joe as well. So I think it definitely could be worth a look.
Thank you, Leslie, to stay on this complicated case. To read more, visit kcentv.com. You can also listen to the podcast episode, The Principal's Wife. It's out now. Just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Leslie, great job. Thanks again.
Kyron Horman was just 7 years old when he vanished from school, never to be seen again. This month marks 10 years since his disappearance, and we are taking a fresh look at the case in today's DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
June 4th, 2010. It's the day Oregon's largest search began for a missing 7-year-old boy, Kyron Horman.
Normal went away on June 4th, and every day we adjust. We try to survive that night. I never thought in a million years we will be here in 10 years. Never. It's sad and it's disappointing and frustrating.
On that June morning in 2010, Kyron's stepmother, Terry Horman, dropped him off at Skyline Elementary School in Northwest Portland. He was seen at the school that morning, excited about attending the school's science fair that day. But when his parents went to meet him at the bus stop after school, he was missing.
I think he was taken from school. I don't think he's been in the area. I think he's out of the area somewhere. I think he's with somebody else. And I still will repeat that we don't have enough information to really tell us, whether he's alive or not.
Kyron's mother believes the stepmother, Terry, is involved. She was the last one to see him.
Just tell us, no matter how bad it is, just tell us and end this roller coaster that we're on every single day.
A new book titled Boy Missing, The Search for Kyron Horman, details shocking claims about the stepmother the day Kyron disappeared.
Literally, one of the adults said they weren't holding hands walking out together, but they left the school together.
Terry has denied any involvement in the boy's disappearance, but she has admitted to failing lie detector tests about that day. The boy's biological parents haven't given up hope.
I know that 10 years later, that's slimmer and slimmer as an option, but I know too that it happens for mothers. It happens. Their kids get to come home.
Kyron, just a young boy at the time, would have been approaching his 18th birthday.
We have missed out on all of the milestones, proms, learning to drive, his first girlfriend, and this June would be his high school graduation.
An entire decade later, the case remains open, but with more questions than answers.
Wow. As a parent, I cannot even imagine. Earlier, Tori spoke with an investigative reporter who's covered this case since day one. Take a look.
We're joined by investigative reporter Kyle E. Boshi from KGW8 in Portland, Oregon. Thank you, Kyle, for joining us. You've covered this case since the day Kyron went missing. 10 years later, did you really ever think we'd still be here today? And tell us where things stand.
Yeah, just like his parents, I figured this case would have been solved by now. Police say, listen, this is still an open, active investigation. They're offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of Kyron Horman. But the challenge here is time it's not on their side. I mean, it's been 10 years, and sadly, a lot of the original detectives and prosecutors in the case have now retired or moved on.
That's the worst. There are thousands of missing person cases in the U.S., but this one, Kyle, gained national attention, and it prompted the biggest search operation in Oregon. Why do you think, personally, it spoke to so many people?
You're right. Sadly, there are a lot of missing kids out there. I think this case stands out for a couple of reasons. One, he disappeared from school. I mean, as a parent, that's where we hope that our kids are safe, right? At school. The other thing is, there have been so many twists and turns in this case surrounding the stepmother, Terry Horman, and the family dynamics. People have really been interested in that. But I've got to remind folks, listen, at the end of the day, don't be distracted by all that family drama. This case really is about a missing little boy.
That's so true. Now, as you were saying, a new book just came out. The author wrote that witnesses saw the stepmother leave with Kyron and wash his backpack that day. Have police spoken out on these theories at all? And was Terry ever named a suspect or no?
So Terry Horman has never been named a suspect or a person of interest by law enforcement. A judge at one point called her a prime suspect. As far as those details, who may have seen Kyron coming and going from school, police have been generally pretty vague about that over the years, never confirming specifically who was the last one to see Kyron or where. As for Terry Horman, the stepmother, she's now moved to California, has remarried, and maintained her innocence throughout all this.
Wow. I'm glad you put the focus back on Kyron. That's what's important here. Thank you so much for your hard work, Kyle. To read more on this case, visit kgw.com. You can also listen to the podcast episode, The Kyron Horman Case, out now. You just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Kyle, thanks again.
James Whitey Bulger ruled the Boston underworld for decades. He grew up in a housing project in South Boston with his parents and 5 siblings. His first run-in with the law was at 13 years old. Fast forward to 1956. Bulger was arrested for robbing banks and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he only served 9, 3 of which were at Alcatraz, America's most notorious prison. Upon his release, he returned to South Boston and became a member of the Winter Hill Gang. He later teamed up with Italian mob gangster Stephen Flemmi. Between the 1970s and 80s, the pair was said to be involved in numerous murders. They became secret FBI informants for their handler, FBI agent John Connolly. They provided information on the mafia to him in exchange for protection. In 1995, Flemmi was arrested. Connolly tipped off Bulger about his own impending arrest, and that's when he fled. Bulger and his girlfriend Catherine Gregg went into hiding for 16 years. During that time, Bulger was second on the FBI's most wanted list, right behind Osama bin Laden. And then, in 2011, the FBI pleads for the public's help finding Catherine, hoping it would lead to Bulger.
This is an announcement by the FBI. Have you seen this woman?
The plea worked. The FBI was tipped off to an apartment in California where the pair was found living under alias names. Bulger was taken into custody and indicted. After a lengthy trial in 2013, he was found guilty on 31 counts, including extortion, money laundering, drug dealing, weapons possessions, and held responsible for the murder of 11 people. He was sentenced to life in prison. In 2018, Bulger was transferred to Hazleton Federal Prison in West Virginia. Less than 24 hours later, he was murdered. The 89-year-old's death was rumored to be a mob hit, and while there's speculation of which inmates were involved, no one has been charged to this day.
Casey and Dave, thank you so much for joining us here on DBL. Now, your book focuses on James Whitey Bulger, his later years, I should say, and you guys actually obtained letters from the crime boss himself detailing his years on the run and also in prison. What was the biggest surprise from all those letters?
Well, I think the biggest surprise was Whitey Bulger describing his own capture. For the first time, you're hearing from the former fugitive crime boss what it was like to be lured out of his apartment in Santa Monica and down to the carport where the FBI finally put the cuffs on him.
And you guys were the only journalists who were given access. What was it like inside that apartment?
He had all sorts of guns hidden in the walls. The FBI really tore that place apart looking for evidence. They found $822,000 in cash. And when Casey and I went into the apartment, it was in full renovation mode, but you could still really feel the ghosts of Bulger in there. And you could really envision how he lived really in his own personal prison. You know, it was really an eerie feeling to be inside of there.
I bet. And you guys also received letters from Freddie Gias. Now, he's the man accused of killing Whitey in jail. What was revealed in those conversations?
Well, it's interesting that Freddie Gius has been corresponding with Dave and I for well over a year, writing letters in a rubber-tipped pencil from solitary confinement. And they won't give him anything sharp because they're afraid he'll jab himself in the neck or try to kill a guard. And he's just kind of walking us through, his world and the possible motivations that he may have had to get inside Whitey Bulger's cell for the last 2 minutes of his life.
Was there any motivation on his end?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. Freddie Gius was an enforcer for the mafia in Springfield, the Italian mob. And as such, Whitey Bulger was one of the most notorious Italian mob rats in history. He spent his career putting Italian mobsters in jail. Some of the most famous Italian mafia members in Boston's history, Whitey's ratting them out. So Freddie Gius knows that going in.
Wow, fascinating. I'm so interested in this stuff. Now there's talk in this book, that book that you guys have right now currently, that it's talk that it might go to Hollywood. We all know Johnny Depp famously played Whitey Bulger in the movie Black Mass.
Just getting started.
Boom!
Jump to the sky for my people. Till it's gone.
But your book talks about Whitey later on in life. So who do you guys see playing Whitey later on in life?
We're talking internally about Bryan Cranston, about Woody Harrelson. And Whitey Bulger himself was a huge fan of Hollywood. He didn't watch the movie Black Mass because Johnny Depp, played him as the government informant that Whitey Bulger was. And Bulger has his own mythology and certainly didn't appreciate how he was portrayed there.
Wow, fascinating stuff, guys. I could talk to you all day, but we got to run. Hunting Whitey, the inside story of the capture and killing of America's most wanted crime boss is on sale now. I'll be getting it for sure, guys. Thank you so much for joining us here at DBL.
Barbara Nantes was a 15-year-old girl living a happy and carefree life with her boyfriend, Jim Alt.
I was a surfer. She was a girl that worshiped the sun.
It was the summer of 1978. The two were camping out at Torrey Pines State Beach in San Diego, California.
We thought, we're gonna have fun, man. This is cool. We're gonna camp out and until we have to leave.
That night, the couple fell asleep in their sleeping bags on the beach, only to be woken up to the unimaginable. Barbara was beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death. She was found naked with sand stuffed in her mouth.
One of the saddest things for me as a parent, losing a child at 15, is that you're thinking she never had a chance to make her mark.
Jim was knocked unconscious during the attack.
What they used to bash my head in was a rock and a log out of the fire pit.
He barely survived and has no memory of that night. 42 years have passed, and police still don't know who's responsible.
That was the worst part about it, is thinking whoever it was still out there.
Detectives tested DNA on everything at the scene, from the sleeping bags to fingernail scrapings. The small traces of DNA found were unidentifiable.
I gave up hope of them finding the killer a long time ago.
In 2014, detectives made the discovery that Barbara's case was strikingly similar to another murder. 6 years after Barbara's death, 14-year-old Claire Huff's body was found on the same beach, with the same severed body parts and mouth stuffed with sand. At Claire's crime scene, police found cigarette butts that traced an unknown male's DNA. New software out today can test it and potentially find new results.
If there were mixtures that perhaps the analyst at the crime lab was unable to interpret at the time, I would suggest that they go back and look at that data and see if it could be sent to cybergenetics for reanalysis.
4 decades later, Jim still thinks about that haunting night.
It hurts my soul, but I have to come here because no one else will. No one else will. I'm the only one swinging for Barbara.
We're joined by investigative producer David Gottfredson from CBS 8 in San Diego, California. Thank you so much for joining us, David. Now, we just heard a forensic DNA expert say old evidence could be retested using new technology. So why hasn't that happened yet? By the way, as a parent, this story, I think this is any parent's worst nightmare, especially knowing how horrific the details are.
Absolutely terrible. I have 2 daughters myself. I can't imagine what this family is going through. As far as we know, San Diego police is aware of that new technology, and as far as we know, they're using it, because they sent me a statement saying they are willing to use it, but they are not going to give me the play-by-play on every test result from every piece of evidence. They're keeping evidence close to the vest, but it's very possible that this case is one DNA hit away from being solved.
Wow. All right, now, David, there are similar murders that happened around the same time as Barbara's. How likely is it that they could be connected?
There was one other murder on the same beach 6 years later, 14-year-old Claire Huff. And for decades, detectives thought the same murderer was responsible for both of them. But then in 2012, they got a DNA hit on Claire Huff's case, came back to a registered sex offender, and he's deceased, and he was in prison at the time of the Barbara Nantes murder 6 years earlier, so he could not be responsible for Barbara Nantes' murder.
So you spoke with Jamal, the boyfriend and also victim, and he is still fighting for Barbara. Please tell us, David, what did he tell you?
He's relentless in pursuing this case. You know, he's got a metal plate in his head from having a rock bashed into his forehead. Every year he meets with San Diego police, pushes them to release information, pushes them to actually investigate suspects. And so he has never refused a media interview, as far as I can tell. He drove down here and met me on the beach and did an interview. He's a great guy, and he wants justice for his girlfriend, and he feels really sad and partially responsible because he's the boyfriend on the beach, and he was there to protect his girlfriend in his eyes, and he just got knocked unconscious and has no memory of what happened to her.
Wow. I hope he too gets the justice that he deserves, and it pains me to hear that he feels guilty. Nobody should have to have that weighing on their conscience, especially everything that he has gone through.
Not his fault.
I know, absolutely. Thank you, David. To read more on this case, visit CBS8.com. You can also listen to the podcast episode Murder on the Beach, out now. Just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Thank you again, David, for keeping this case alive.
Catherine Harold was your typical teenager. The 15-year-old spent most of her time hanging out with friends and staying out late. She grew up in Tonawanda, New York, a smaller town just north of Buffalo. It was a summer night in June of 1985. Catherine was with friends at a popular hangout.
And it was an ideal location for kids to hang out and basically drink beer and smoke weed, because there was some foliage around it that hid it from everywhere else.
Catherine never made it home that night. The next morning, her body was found close to that hangout spot.
And she was found on the railroad tracks there, face down on the tracks by an employee of the railroad company.
The autopsy report revealed Catherine was strangled to death. Tonawanda police have spent the last 35 years trying to track down the killer.
There's been DNA testing done in this case. There have been lie detector tests done in this case. There was an FBI profile done in this case.
Now police are looking at the possibility of Catherine being linked to notorious serial killer Altemio Sanchez, also known as the bike path rapist. Sanchez is already behind bars. He's serving a life sentence for raping 50 women and murdering 3 between 1975 and 2006.
The 3 victims that he killed, he didn't rape any of those victims because they fought back. And so those are the 3 victims that he killed. I have no evidence at all that Catherine Harold was raped at all. Okay? So the MO of her death kind of fits the MO to a certain extent of the 3 individuals that he killed.
Investigators say there are other similarities between Catherine's death and Sanchez's victims.
He's been talked to, but obviously we are not beyond identifying not only him but others as persons of interest.
there are mounds of evidence and information. Police just need a break.
This is a case that screams for justice.
We are joined by anchor and reporter Michael Wooten from WGRZ in Buffalo, New York. Thank you, Michael, for joining us. So here's the thing. It's been 35 years, and most cold cases get left in the dark over time. So in your opinion, especially being so involved, what makes this one different?
You know what, for quite a while, this was also a cold case. We go back all the way to 1985, and in the months that followed this pretty horrific murder, police were very involved. They were doing a lot of investigating, but family members said way back then that after a few months, they felt like they really kind of gave up on this investigation. Police actually telling the family that this 15-year-old had started hanging out with the wrong people, that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Wow. And they felt like investigators didn't really do all they could to crack this case.
Michael, investigators are looking at Altemio Sanchez as a suspect. I want to know what he said when he was questioned.
So Altemio Sanchez, known here in Western New York as the bike path rapist or the bike path killer, he eventually would plead guilty to 3 different murders, and he also admitted to, in some cases, maybe more than a dozen rapes. I mean, this was just a serial killer, and he, right before he was sentenced on those 3 murders and was given life in prison, he sat down and did an interview with one of the prosecutors who then became district attorney here and who is now a judge. And from what we're told, was never asked about Catherine Herold's murder. At the time, maybe it wasn't the priority. Maybe they hadn't quite connected the dots.
You mentioned the officers call him the bike path killer. Wow. I want you to elaborate on that and how that name came about. And is there anything else about his victims, in your opinion, that relates specifically to Catherine's case?
Yeah, I think that phrase really kind of speaks to the terror that he calls throughout Western New York. A number of his victims were raped or murdered along bike paths here in Western New York. Not all of them. Catherine Herold was not killed near a bike path, but there were other similarities. And it turns out that where she was murdered was in very close proximity to where Altemio Sanchez worked the overnight shift at a plant. There were also very distinct connections between how she was murdered, how she was strangled and stabbed, and some of the other cases. And so the investigators will tell you to this day that they believe he is certainly a suspect in her killing. The problem is they don't have that silver bullet, right? They don't have that DNA evidence to cross-check. They don't have his confession, which they would love to get.
Michael, we appreciate you, and you know, just by you dedicating the time to shine a spotlight on this case, so vital. And to read more on this case, visit WGRZ.com. You can also listen to the podcast episode, The Bike Path Killer, out now. Just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Thank you, Michael.
Michelle Boyd was a mother and wife living and working as a nurse in San Antonio, Texas. On Thanksgiving Day 2016, she was reported missing. Her car was found abandoned on the east side of town near an intersection.
We're going to find her.
But a bizarre twist. Police reports reveal Michelle disappeared after taping her 5-year-old daughter's mouth shut.
Police found her daughter alone, tied to an ice machine at a Walgreens on Rigsby Avenue.
Police issued a warrant for her arrest. She was nowhere to be found. Michelle's family desperately searched for her and offered a $2,000 reward. And then, almost 2 years later, Michelle was found at a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, using an alias.
We all felt that she was alive somewhere, that she was running, hiding. We knew that she had been exhibiting some paranoia behavior before she left.
Sue says her daughter got sick and went to the hospital, where she eventually gave up her real name. Her family was relieved to find her safe, but confused as to why she ran away and abandoned her family.
A former San Antonio nurse accused of duct taping her daughter's mouth shut, tying her to an ice machine and then taking off, is now back here in the Alamo City.
Michelle is now facing several charges, including child abuse. After years of questions, the family could possibly get some clarity at an upcoming court case.
Earlier, Al and I spoke with a reporter who's been following this case. Take a look at this. We are joined by Sue Kalberg from KENS 5 in San Antonio, Texas. Thank you so much, Sue, for joining us. Now, Michelle is getting ready for her next court date on August 3rd. So, what are we expecting and where does the case stand?
The case is on hold. That August 3rd date may or may not happen. If the attorney had to take a guess, he would say it's going to be pushed back again. And that's good news as far as Michelle is concerned. She's out on bond. The attorney says she's doing well. And as long as she continues to do well, the case will move forward when it moves forward because of the COVID-19 concerns, the pandemic concerns. All of the courts here in Bexar County have been shut down.
Well, that leads me to my next question. How is Michelle's family coping with everything today? It's had to have been a whirlwind of emotions, thinking that she was missing, only to find out that she ran away.
Right. The family is concerned with taking care of that child. They want as much as humanly possible to recover, to be able to continue to live life as a family, for Michelle to recover. And so Michelle is doing well. And so they're hoping to move forward as a family. This happened in the past, and this has been dragging on for a couple of years. So they're hoping that every day goes by is another chance for the family to rebuild itself. So they're full of hope.
Wow, that's good to have. Now, has she ever spoken out about why she ran away or taped up her daughter that day?
No, and furthermore, her legal team is telling her not to talk to anybody as long as the court case is holding over her head. It's important to note that in addition to the criminal charge, there's a concurrent case with the Child Protective Services system in terms of who's going to get custody of the child for the long term. So it's important for Michelle to keep a low profile and do what she's supposed to do now and not really talk to anybody yet about what happened then.
Wow. I hope for closure on this one. Thank you so much, Sue. To read more on this case, visit KENS5.com. You can also listen to the podcast episode Michelle Boyd, out now. Just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Thanks again, Sue. Two decades ago, a Florida man was murdered in his own home in front of his wife. The case went cold, but now new DNA testing may give his family a chance at closure. Here's today's True Crime Chronicles.
Saad Kawaf and his wife were well known in the Jacksonville, Florida community. The two owned the Forest Discount Food Store. They lived in the gated Deerwood Park Country Club, where crime is something homeowners aren't used to. But that all changed the morning of May 17, 1999. It was around 9:30 a.m. when Saad walked out of his home.
A few minutes later, Mrs. Kawaf heard a scream come from the garage.
Mrs. Kawaf opened the door and saw her husband being beaten and stabbed by a man. Then a woman attacked her and tied her up inside. Police say the male attacker grabbed Mrs. Kawaf, put a knife to her throat and said, "Give me the money."
He would make deposits several times a week at the bank, so feel that that's definitely somebody was watching his activity.
The attackers stole $30,000 and fled. Saad died from the brutal stabbing. Police had a description of the suspects and DNA obtained from Mrs. Kawaf biting one of the attackers, but the case still went cold. That all changed this June, thanks to genetic genealogy. A former Jacksonville sheriff, William Bear Jr., a man fitting the description Mrs. Kawaf gave back in 1999, was positively identified to match the DNA from the scene all those years ago.
He was an active police officer with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office at the time of the murder.
Days later, a female's DNA was matched to Melissa Jo Schaefer, who was William Bear's wife back in 1999. With both suspects behind bars and awaiting trial, the Kawaf family can only wait and hope to finally have closure after all these years.
Earlier, I spoke with a reporter who's been following the case the whole time. Take a look. We're joined today by investigative journalist Katie Jeffries from First Coast News in Jacksonville, Florida. First off, Katie, thank you for joining us. We just heard that William Bear Jr. was an active police officer at the time of the murder. So could his time with the sheriff's department be used to help him in any way during the trial?
It doesn't seem like it at this point. In fact, trying to get his bond reduced, his lawyer actually filed some paperwork and cited his time in law enforcement as a reason that he could be trusted to have a reduced bond. And at this point, it doesn't seem like that argument has carried any weight with the judge because he's still in jail under no bond at this point. So at least right now, it doesn't seem like his time with law enforcement is going to help him.
This murder was in a gated community with surveillance cameras. So how did Bear avoid detection during the initial investigation back in '99?
So the sheriff's office confirmed that Bear was actually investigating Saad Khawaf at the time of this murder. And part of that was conducting surveillance on the house. So law enforcement sources tell me that when they went back and they were watching the surveillance tapes of cars that were coming and going, that they saw William Bear's car coming and going, but because he was supposed to be there as part of this ongoing investigation, it didn't raise any red flags to them at the time. But then, of course, when the genetic genealogy came back and those pieces started to come together, then they started to see kind of how that was falling into place.
Wow, he slipped right through. Since he retired from the sheriff's department in 2002, 3 years after Saad Khawaf's murder, does that mean any cases William Bear worked on during that time can now be reopened?
You know, that's a question that we did ask the state attorney's office, especially right after this happened. And it's something that I think they're trying to work through because really it calls into question basically every case he's worked from his time at the sheriff's office from the 1970s all the way to 2002. And some local defense attorneys have told us it's something that they're looking into to see if William Bear was someone who testified at their client's trial, because there could be an argument made that he wouldn't have the same credibility with the jury now as he did back then. So that's something I know defense attorneys are definitely looking into.
I would want to be, if I were in one of those court trials, I would definitely want that to be retried, because I think you're absolutely right. The credibility is just gone after all this. This is such an interesting case.
Exactly.
I really appreciate you, Katie. Thank you so much. To read more about this case, visit firstcoastnews.com. You can also listen to the podcast episode, Murder in the Driveway. It's out now. Just go ahead and search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Katie, thanks again for sticking with this story.
A man was out for revenge, and his disturbing plot led to one of the largest investigations in state history. Here's a look at the Eric Williams murders in today's True Crime Chronicles.
Kaufman, Texas is a small, quaint, and quiet town. But in 2013, it became the site of fear and chaos. Mark Hasse was well known as the Kaufman County's assistant district attorney. He handled some of the toughest cases in the county. It was January 31st, 2013. Mark pulled up to the courthouse for work and was shot outside his car in the early morning hours. Moments later, a gunman was seen fleeing the scene.
Who I feel sorry for is Mark Hasse. Mark Hasse's mother, a mature woman in her 80s, that her son was killed in the street for doing his job.
Police conducted a massive manhunt for the killer. 2 months passed, and a town already on edge was hit again. Kaufman County District Attorney Mike McClelland and his wife Cynthia were found dead inside their home. Early Wiley, the current DA, was appointed after his death. She and other elected officials were living in fear.
It was a lesson learned that you don't know who might be the one that's coming after you.
A month later, police arrest Eric Williams and his wife Kim for all 3 murders.
I think Eric thought he was beyond the law and that he was smarter than everybody.
Eric Williams was a former attorney who had been convicted of burglary and theft while in office. McClelland and Hasse both prosecuted him for the crime. Police later learned the 2 men were on his hit list, and so was the current DA. It was all part of Williams' plan to get revenge.
He planned to kill me because I had the audacity to question him. In his warped mind, I was the beginning of his end.
A year later, Eric was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. Wiley wrote a book about living in fear and the terror Williams caused.
He is gone now, but my county and I survived.
Earlier, Al and I spoke with a reporter who was in the courtroom for this trial. Take a look. And we are joined by investigative reporter Tanya Ayers from WFAA in Dallas, Texas. So, Tanya, thank you so much for joining us and bringing this story to light. How horrifying. How did police determine that Eric was responsible for the murders? What evidence did they have to charge him?
This is probably one of the most horrific and crazy cases I have ever covered in my career as a police reporter. The commonality here in the victims is that Mark Hasse and Mike McClelland had prosecuted Eric Williams for the theft of these county computers back when he was a justice of the peace. So everybody suspected Eric Williams, but the linchpin in terms of evidence was investigators found a Crime Stoppers tip number in Eric's home. That's a tip number that only the person that made that tip could have had. And when he made these tips, he said some things that only the killer could have known. And then the other key piece of evidence was a live round that had cycled through the weapon that had killed the McClellans that was found in a storage shed that Eric Williams had a friend rent secretly.
Well, speaking of Eric, he's on death row right now. Obviously, he's trying to appeal that process. Can you give us an update on what his status is, and how about his former wife, Kim? Like, what's going on with her?
Eric's been on death row now for 5.5 years. He's still in the process of appealing. It's going to the Court of Criminal Appeals now. Kim Williams has, got a 40-year sentence. She doesn't come up for even a parole hearing until 2033, and her release date is 2053, assuming that she is never granted parole.
Unbelievable. So here's the thing, Tanya. As you know, Eric has only given one jailhouse interview. What did he have to say about all of this?
Not surprisingly, Eric Williams continues to deny these killings. And having covered this whole case and watched him in the trial, that really doesn't surprise me. It was very clear when this 12-member jury found him guilty and then sentenced him to the death penalty that he was surprised. I think he really thought he was going to get away with it.
Yeah, from what I know about the story, too, he just seems like a pure narcissist, and I really hope that justice will continue to be served. Tanya, thank you so much. And to all of our DBL viewers, to read more on this case, visit first WFAA.com. You can also listen to the podcast episode, Eric Williams' Murder, which is out now. Just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player.
It was 1971. Daryl Cinquanta was working as a Denver police officer when he was shot in the stomach by Lawrence Pusateri, an escaped convict from California. Lawrence was caught and convicted for the shooting, only for him to escape again. He led police on a nearly 50-year chase until a phone call this summer changed everything.
This person says, I thought about it, and I'm going to tell you where the guy is that shot you.
Daryl, now retired from the Denver Police Department, started his own private investigation firm years ago and never gave up finding the convict who shot him.
And of course, I was skeptical. 46 years later, now the clear blue, I get a phone call. Well, this person gives me his address, his alias.
With that information, Daryl tracks down a man named Ramon Montoya. He was tied to a drunk driving case and this mugshot. The pieces aligned. That man was Lawrence Pusateri. Lawrence has been living under an alias in Espanola, New Mexico for the past 40 years. Daryl tipped off local police and FBI to the fugitive's home.
They surrounded it with a SWAT unit, and they went in and got him.
46 years later, a story of redemption and a full circle moment for Daryl.
I'm reveling in the fact that I got him, and they're going to extradite him back, and I'm going to try to see him.
We are joined by investigative reporter Jeremy Hohola from 9 News right here in Denver, Colorado. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. Now, you recently spoke with Daryl, the retired detective. He mentioned he wants to sit down and talk to Lawrence. What does he want to tell him all these years later?
Yeah, I know. What do you say to a person who shot you so many decades ago and then you catch them? I asked Daryl that very question. Daryl told me that he would initially commend him for staying under the radar for so long. But then I think he also doesn't really know what he would say to this guy. I think he'd probably come up with that the day they would meet, if they would ever meet.
Jeremy, do we know who the mystery caller was that tipped Daryl off? And was Lawrence's family ever aware he was living under an alias?
So I understand that Daryl, for decades, has been making calls to this man's family for years and to friends. It's unknown who that caller is. Maybe that caller got fed up with Lawrence. Maybe that caller was angry at him and just decided to come out of the blue, as Daryl said in that report, that he was going to turn over his name. As far as his family is concerned, I understand he was living with a wife who was completely oblivious to his past. So this came as a shock to her, from what I understand.
Unbelievable. It's like a horrific, creepy movie. And Jeremy, you previously worked as an investigative reporter in New Mexico. So can you tell us more about where Lawrence was found and how he evaded capture for so long?
So in this part of New Mexico, it's outside of the Santa Fe area. Everybody knows where Santa Fe, New Mexico is. It's kind of in the heart of the state. Outside of Santa Fe, the city of Espanola has been there for a very, very, very long time, since the late 1500s. It's a very old city. It's not a major metropolitan area. The population is about 10,000 people. So you're able to fly under the radar in an area like this, and people generally, keep to themselves in this part of the state. So back then, when this man evaded law enforcement, he was able to fly under the radar and likely create a whole new identity because, the internet really didn't exist back then in its current form. You could create paper documents. Nothing was digitized. So it was much easier to create a false identity. And that's what this guy did for decades.
Unbelievable. Yeah. And Jeremy, thank you so much for your investigative work. To learn more about this case, DBL Nation, you can visit 9news.com. Sherry Papini's story is one of the most mysterious unsolved cases in California. The mother claims she was abducted, held captive, and then released. We are taking a fresh look at the case in DBL's True Crime Chronicles.
Sherry Papini was described as a supermom by her husband, Keith. The couple was happily married, raising 2 kids. On November 2nd, 2016, Sherry went for a run in the small town of Mountain Gate in Shasta County, California. Later that day, she never picked up her kids from daycare. Her husband frantically called her, but no answer. So he tracked her phone and called 911.
So I just drove down there and I saw her phone with her headphones because she started running again. And I found her phone and it's got like hair ripped out of it, like in the headphones. So I'm like totally freaking out, thinking like somebody grabbed her.
Police issued a massive search and investigation.
As the details continue to surface and new tips come in,
Keith knew his wife would never abandon their kids and feared the worst.
Bring her home. Bring her home. Just bring her home.
22 days later, a trucker spots Sherry on the side of a rural road, 150 miles away from home. She was bound at the waist by a chain, a hose clamp was fixed to her ankles, and she had been beaten, bruised, and branded on her shoulder. Surveillance video shows Sherry running frantically near an interstate just moments before she was found. Sherry claimed she had been abducted and held captive.
we do not know who the captors are. We do not know a motive at this time.
This is the sketch of the 2 Hispanic women Sherry claimed to have kidnapped her.
She is very relieved to be returned home safely and be reunited with her husband.
Home, safe, but yet so many questions unanswered. Why was she abducted? And how did she escape?
You never think you'd be in a position like this. I would never wish this feeling upon anybody.
And earlier, Eric and I spoke with an investigative reporter in California who's been working on this case. Take a look. We are joined by investigative reporter Ananda Rochita from ABC 10 in Sacramento, California. Thank you for joining us. Now, it's been almost 4 years now. How is Sherry doing today? What are the latest developments in the case?
Yeah, Sherry is barely seen out of her home, and her husband Keith has just talked to reporters just a few times since everything happened. I did reach out to the Shasta County Sheriff's Department and the FBI, who are investigating this case as well, and they said they have no more information to give out to the public, but that this is still an open investigation.
Ananda, investigators did find traces of DNA on Sherry's clothes. So will they ever retest that with new DNA technology similar to what was used to catch the Golden State Killer?
That is a possibility. So the DNA that was found on Sherry's body when she was found, they tested it through a system called CODIS. It's FBI's combined DNA index system, but it works with only a small pool of people because it's relatively new. It was created in the 1990s, and if you're not in the system already for a crime, then it wouldn't be able to match that DNA to people in the system. So genetic genealogy has really been a game changer for a lot of agencies, and there is a possibility that they may have be testing this but not making it public. It's something that a lot of agencies are doing right now, and we're hearing about it once they make that arrest. So the big case, like you mentioned, was the Golden State Killer case.
What's crazy to me is all the controversy surrounding this case. Some people say that Sherry fabricated the kidnapping because she reappeared on the road one day. How have police responded to that theory? Is there any credence to it?
So they have responded to some of the theories. One of them is whether Sherry left willingly or she was kidnapped. So just a few days before she disappeared, she was talking to a man from Michigan and texting him. The Sheriff's Department did follow up on that lead, and they say that he was not involved in her disappearance whatsoever, and that even her husband is not considered a suspect in this case too. There was also some speculation on whether she could have been targeted for human trafficking. There was also possibility of this being involvement of a cult. So when she was found, she was bruised, battered, her hair was cut very short, and she was also branded. And the Sheriff's Department only said branded, but they wouldn't specify what kind of branding was found on her. They said that that is confidential, but they are following up on that lead.
Wow.
But as for now, the Sheriff's Department wouldn't comment on the human trafficking or whether this was a cult, but they are still saying that this is an open investigation, and there is a $10,000 reward leading up to information that would ID those two suspects.
Heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. I just pray that justice is brought. Thank you so much, Ananda, for bringing this case to light. Very important. And for the latest on this case, DBL Nation, visit abc10.com. You can also listen to the new podcast episode, Sherry Papini Kidnapping. Just search True Crime Chronicles on your favorite podcast player. Thank you, Ananda. That wraps up our 2-night True Crime Chronicles marathon. Thank you for tuning in.